Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most significant shift in modern economic power is not happening in Beijing or Brussels, but right here along the 49th parallel? And what if I told you that a political strategy built on decades of assumed dominance has just collapsed, not because of a military strike or a formal treaty, but because of the quiet, coordinated refusal of millions of ordinary citizens to be bullied? We are living through a moment that historians will likely look back upon as a turning point, a moment where the rule book of international relations was rewritten in real time. For decades, the assumption in Washington has been absolute. When the United States applies pressure, smaller economies cave. When the giant speaks, the neighbor listens. It is a worldview rooted in leverage, size, and the belief that economic dependence flows only one way. But in the last year, that assumption has collided with a new reality. We are witnessing a phenomenon that few in the American political establishment predicted, and even fewer know how to handle. We are watching the systematic dismantling of the bullying doctrine. Today, we are going to look strictly at the facts. We are going to put aside the noise of the daily news cycle and look at the deep data, the export numbers, the bankruptcy filings, the employment statistics, to answer a single critical question. Why is Canada outsmarting the architects of this trade war? And why are states like Kentucky paying the price? To truly grasp the magnitude of the economic devastation currently unfolding in the American South, we must first examine the provocation that started it all. A story that begins with a level of arrogance that inevitably transitions into consequence. On Christmas Day, a timing that adds a layer of cultural insult to injury, Donald Trump picked a fight that no one expected. He did not merely propose a tariff adjustment or a regulatory review. He went after the very existence of his neighbors. He floated the idea, however jokingly he might claim it to be, that Canada should become the 51st state. This was not an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern where sovereign nations are treated like distressed real estate assets. He went after Greenland, he went after Panama, and then he turned his sights north. He essentially told Canadians to their faces that their sovereignty, their economy, and their national identity were negotiable, that if they could not withstand his economic pressure, they should simply dissolve into the American Union. The strategic calculation in Washington was simple, albeit flawed. The belief was that Canada, fearing economic isolation, would beg for mercy. The belief was that if you threaten a country enough, if you insult its leadership and threaten its borders, the population will turn on their own leaders and demand capitulation to restore the flow of trade. It was the logic of the schoolyard bully who is shocked when no one shows up to his birthday party. It operates on the delusion that intimidation produces respect. But what the architects of this strategy failed to understand, what they have never understood, is that you cannot threaten people into friendship, and you cannot strong-arm entire nations into better trade deals when their dignity is on the line. The American political establishment expected silence or submission. Instead, they received one of the most brutal economic counterpunches modern trade has ever seen. And critically, this counterpunch did not come primarily from government decrees. It came from you. Now, before we analyze the consumer response that followed, we must appreciate the diplomatic maneuver that set the stage. The United States is accustomed to dealing with career politicians who speak in vague platitudes to smooth over tension. But in this crisis, they ran into a different kind of figure, Mark Carney. When the rhetoric about the 51st state began, and when the demands to dismantle Canada's dairy system were renewed, the response was not the usual diplomatic hedging. Mark Carney, bringing the precision of a central banker rather than the ambiguity of a politician, drew a bright red line. He stated, unequivocally, that Canada is not for sale. This moment matters because it shifted the conflict from a negotiation about tariffs to a defense of sovereignty. When Trump and Carney met on the sidelines of a World Cup event that was supposed to symbolize North American unity, the contrast was stark. Trump, operating on a transactional worldview, viewed sovereignty as a bargaining chip. He implies that Canada could escape trade pressure by accepting absorption. That is not negotiation. That is coercion dressed up as pragmatism. Carney's response was to refuse the premise entirely. He did not engage in the theater of insults. He pushed the dispute into the formal review processes of the trade agreement, the USMCA. This may sound boring to the casual observer, but it was a tactical masterstroke. By moving the fight from the chaotic realm of Trump-essa press conferences to the structured realm of trade tribunals, Carney signaled that Canada would absorb short-term pain rather than surrender long-term autonomy. Trump, paradoxically, praised Carney as tough and world-class, revealing a fascinating psychological dynamic. Bullies often respect resistance more than accommodation. But respect did not stop the economic machinery from grinding forward. The U.S. administration expected that, despite the tough talk, the economic reality would force Canada's hand. They were wrong, and they were wrong because they forgot about the third player in this game, the consumer. While diplomatic strategies set the rules, there is another force at play here. one that economists call consumer sovereignty. It is the idea that, ultimately, it is the person with the wallet who drives market outcomes. Usually this is a passive force. We buy what is cheap. We buy what is available. Individual choices rarely feel significant. But what we have seen in the last year is the weaponization of consumer sovereignty. Furious at being treated like a vassal state, Canadians launched what is now being described as the largest consumer boycott in living memory. There were no government orders banning American goods. There were no new laws passed in Parliament to block imports. There were simply millions of people deciding, largely on their own, to stop buying products from a nation that openly threatened their existence. And here is where the failure of the American strategy becomes glaringly obvious. This boycott was not random. It was intuitive, deliberate, and surgical. It targeted the very industries that define the American identity and, more cynically, the industries that fund the political careers of those who remained silent in the face of these threats. The boycott zeroed in on the bourbon and wine industries, sectors that have poured millions into Republican campaigns. Suddenly, the constituents of Mitch McConnell found themselves staring down an existential crisis. The goal was to make the enablers of this policy feel the cost of their silence. And friends, the data confirms that the cost has been catastrophic. To see the real-world impact of this consumer uprising, we need only look at the state of Kentucky. This is the home of Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. It is the heartland of the American spirit industry. It is a state that voted overwhelmingly for the current administration. If the trade war was working as intended, Kentucky should be thriving, protected by tariffs and America First policies. Instead, Kentucky's signature $9 billion bourbon industry is in freefall. The numbers are not just bad, they are historic. In the last year, the United States has lost 85% of its bourbon export market to Canada. Let that number sink in. 85%. This is not a market correction. This is not a downturn. This is a market collapse. U.S. spirit sales in Canada declined 68% in 2025 alone. The impact of these numbers is now translating into physical dismantling of the industry. Jim Beam, one of the most iconic names in American history, a brand synonymous with Kentucky, is shutting down its main distillery for the entirety of 2026. This is a facility that has been running continuously since 1935. Through wars, through recessions, through global instability, the stills kept running. But they could not survive the arrogance of this trade policy. 1,500 unionized workers are now left in limbo. These are men and women who did not vote to threaten Canada. They did not ask for a trade war. But they are the ones paying the price. The industry is attempting to spin this. They are claiming there is a whiskey glut. They are blaming shifts in youth drinking habits, as if millennials and Gen Z suddenly decided en masse to stop drinking bourbon in a span of 6 months. But the data betrays them. Production this year is already down 55 million gallons compared to last year. If you are making dramatically less product and you still have a glut, it is because your customers have abandoned you. The situation is even more dire for the premium brands. Take the case of Kentucky Owl Bourbon. This company declared bankruptcy in October. Their story is a warning sign for the entire sector. When they tried to use their aging whiskey barrels as collateral to pay down their debts, the courts rejected the proposal. Why? Because Judge Everett, hearing testimony from market experts, concluded that the barrel market is dismal. Selling that inventory without steep discounts would be impossible. Think about the implications of that ruling. Aging whiskey is supposed to be an appreciating asset. It is like gold or real estate. It gains value the longer it sits. But because the export market to Canada has evaporated, those barrels have effectively become worthless. The entire economic model of the bourbon industry, investing today for a payout years down the line, has been upended. This is structural damage. This is not something that can be fixed with a quick treaty. Beyond the immediate closures, the most terrifying aspect for American producers is the concept of stickiness in consumer habits, which threatens the permanence of these lost markets. Bourbon used to be a reflex in Canadian bars and restaurants. A customer would order a whiskey and Coke, and the bartender would reach for the Jim Beam rail without thinking. It was the default. But once you break that habit, once you force the bartender to reach for a Canadian rye or an Irish whiskey or a local craft spirit, you break the monopoly of the mind. Reports from the Canadian restaurant industry show that bartenders are experimenting with alternatives they never would have considered before. And the customers are responding. People are finding they like the alternatives. Some prefer them. And many are making a principled choice to keep buying them even if the tariffs were lifted tomorrow. Once market share is lost in this manner, it does not automatically return when the politics shift. Brand loyalty is a fragile thing. Once it is broken, it is incredibly hard to rebuild. The Canadian market for American bourbon may never fully recover. The 85% drop represents a generational shift in consumption. And it isn't just bourbon. The rot is spreading to other sectors of the manufacturing economy in these same states. While the bourbon industry collapses, The manufacturing sector in Kentucky is facing a parallel disaster, exposing the bait and switch of the current American economic populism. In Glendale, Kentucky, Ford laid off 1,600 employees right before Christmas. These were good jobs. These were the kinds of jobs that built the American middle class. The administration had announced a war on electric vehicles, ending subsidies and targeting manufacturers, creating an environment of uncertainty that allowed competitors like China to pace ahead. The result was the closure of the battery plant and the dismissal of 1,600 workers with no notice. And what is replacing it? The administration and local officials are touting a new AI data center. This is the perfect metaphor for the current economic reality in the U.S. They are trading 1,600 union-paying manufacturing jobs for a data center that employs a handful of technicians. But worse, this data center will consume massive amounts of power and water. The local residents are left with higher electric bills, higher water bills, and zero jobs. As one commentator noted, the economy feels like it's running people over. Amazon, one of the largest employers, announced layoffs of 600,000 workers. The sheer scale of these numbers, estimating 600 here, 600,000 there, paints a picture of an economy that is shedding its working class while its leaders distract the population with foreign policy feuds. The promise was that tariffs would bring trillions of dollars in jobs back to America. Trump claimed the U.S. was an A++ economy, but the reality on the ground in Kentucky is shuttered factories, bankrupt distilleries, and a workforce being told that their livelihoods are the necessary sacrifice for a trade war that is failing. Nowhere is the clash of values and systems more apparent than in the dairy sector, often referred to as the milk war that Trump thought he would win easily. The U.S. administration demanded that Canada dismantle its supply management system. They framed this as an issue of fairness. They argued that American farmers were locked out. But let's look at what fairness means in the American context. The U.S. dairy system is built on overproduction. It is designed to grow bigger, faster, and cheaper. This leads to massive surpluses that domestic consumers cannot eat or drink. The American system relies on exporting this surplus to survive. When exports dry up, the system crashes. This model has devastated rural America. Small family farms are wiped out by corporate consolidation. Stress levels rise. Suicides among American farmers have become a tragic epidemic. Canada made a different choice decades ago. We chose supply management. It is a system designed to match production with demand. It ensures stability. It keeps the family farm solvent. It prevents the boom and bust cycle that plagues American agriculture. Trump wanted to break this system. He wanted to export America's structural failure to Canada. He wanted Canada to absorb the U.S. surplus so that American corporate agriculture could keep expanding. Carney said no. He framed supply management not just as an economic policy, but as food sovereignty, the right of a nation to decide how it feeds its people. Trump expected Canada to blink. He assumed the pressure would be too great. Instead, Canada held firm. And what happened? The American surplus had nowhere to go. Prices in the U.S. crashed. Storage facilities filled up. The pain that was supposed to be felt in Quebec and Ontario was instead felt in Wisconsin and New York. The milk war revealed that the U.S. system is incredibly fragile. It works only if there is always someone else to dump the product on. When the door closes, the house of cards falls. Canada's refusal to dismantle its system protected its farmers, while the U.S. strategy accelerated the demise of its own small producers. So we have seen the devastation in the U.S., but what about Canada, the country that was supposed to cave, the country that was supposed to be the 51st state? The data tells a story that is almost embarrassing for the American administration. Canada is not collapsing. Canada is booming. While the U.S. grapples with an affordability crisis that Trump dismisses as a hoax, Canada created 54,000 new jobs just last month. This is not a fluke. This represents 3 consecutive months of job growth. Unemployment is at a 16-month low. The banking sector is currently comparing conditions in Canada to the tech boom of the late 90s. How is this possible? How can a country under attack by its largest trading partner be thriving? It is because Canada found alternatives. The boycott galvanized the domestic market. Businesses diversified their supply chains. The economy proved to be far more resilient than the bullies in Washington gave it credit for. Canada didn't just survive the economic war. By almost every metric, Canada is winning it. This economic reality brings us directly to the political fallout, because in a healthy democracy, one would expect leaders to stand up when their signature industries are destroyed. But in Kentucky, the silence from the Republican establishment has been deafening. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, has said almost nothing. He has watched the Jim Beam plant announce its closure. He has watched the whiskey barrels become worthless. He has watched his constituents lose their jobs. Why? Because standing up to Trump has become politically unthinkable within the party. Loyalty to the leader now outweighs the economic well-being of ordinary workers. They are willing to let their own state's economy burn rather than challenge a failing strategy. However, there is a contrast. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear has shown what real leadership looks like. Unlike the senators who remain silent, Beshear called out the administration's falsehoods. He called Trump's denial of the affordability crisis a slap in the face to the people of Kentucky. Beshear acknowledged that he listens to his constituents. He expressed the frustration that so many feel that Trump simply does not get it. He does not understand that leadership carries responsibility. He does not understand that attacking your allies causes lasting damage to your own people. The contrast between Beshear and McConnell tells you everything about the current state of American politics. One speaks the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. The other watches his state suffer in silence. Before we conclude, we must address the single most important strategic development that the mainstream media has largely missed, one that goes far beyond bourbon or manufacturing jobs. It is what I call the Great Decoupling, and it represents the inversion of the financial world order we have known for 70 years. For generations, the economic relationship between our two nations was defined by a branch plant mentality. Canada was the resource hinterland. The United States was the headquarters. Canada was the junior partner. The U.S. was the safe bet. Investors bought U.S. dollars to hide from risk, and they bought Canadian dollars only when they wanted to gamble on commodities. But in the last 12 months, that dynamic has flipped. By weaponizing trade against its closest ally, the United States has introduced a political risk premium into its own currency and markets. Global capital hates uncertainty. And right now, Washington is the global capital of uncertainty. Mark Carney, in a statement that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, declared that the old relationship is over, and the markets agree with him. While the U.S. struggles with policy-driven chaos, Canada has quietly become the institutional hedge for North America. Look at the numbers that don't make the nightly news. The Canadian stock market is currently outpacing the S&P 500, with the Morningstar Canada Index soaring over 29% in 2025. Why? Because investors are fleeing the volatility of American policy and parking their capital in the one place in North America that still respects the rule of law above the rule of the tweet. Canada is now ranked number 1 in the G20 for fiscal soundness. We are seeing a flight to safety that is directing capital north of the border, not south. This is the financial legacy of this conflict. Canada is no longer just a neighbor. It has graduated to become a distinct, sophisticated asset class, a stable, predictable alternative to an increasingly erratic superpower. We are no longer asking for permission to prosper. We are setting the terms of our own economic future. I would love to hear your perspective on this shift. Is Canada finally making the right strategic moves by standing firm, or are there risks we are overlooking? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Friends, as we look at the data, the 85% drop in exports, the shuttered factories, the desperate silence of Republican leaders, we are clearly witnessing the end of an era. The era where the United States could unilaterally dictate terms to its neighbors through threats and intimidation is over. Canada went elbows up, as the saying goes. They stood their ground. Donald Trump started this war of his own accord. Nobody asked him to threaten Canada on Christmas Day. Nobody forced him to suggest annexation. He acted on his own ego and a profound misunderstanding of how modern economies work. He treated trade like a real estate deal, assuming the other side would fold. But nations are not buildings, and citizens are not tenants. The Canadian people have demonstrated something extraordinary. They have shown that ordinary citizens, making everyday choices about what to put in their glass or on their table, can wield enormous power. They can bring billion-dollar industries to their knees. They can force a superpower to confront the limits of its own influence. Canada is teaching American workers and industries a harsh lesson about the costs of electing leaders who treat international relations as a game of dominance rather than a web of mutual respect. That is a legacy Trump will never be able to escape, and it is a lesson that the empty distilleries of Kentucky will be testifying to for years to come. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful and want to support independent, data-driven reporting, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We will keep following the numbers wherever they lead.